Tony hummed a happy tune, carefully carrying a box labeled kitchen stuff into her new house. Sunlight streamed through the large oak tree in the front yard, dappling the lawn in shifting patterns of light and shade. It was a perfect day for a fresh start. After years of living in the bustling city, she'd finally found a place that felt like home, or at least had the potential to feel that way. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses neatly lined up with manicured lawns and blooming flower beds. It was different from anything she was used to, and she couldn't help but feel a little nervous, but mostly she was excited. Excited to decorate, excited to meet her neighbors, excited to finally have a garden. She paused on the porch, taking a deep breath of the crisp, clean air. This was it. A new chapter. A chance to build a life in a place where she could truly feel at peace. The moving truck was still rumbling down the street, laden with the rest of her belongings. She smiled, imagining the cozy living room she would create, the delicious meal she would cook in her new kitchen, the friendships she would forge. Tony knew that moving into a predominantly white neighborhood wouldn't be without its challenges. She was well aware of the subtle prejudices that still lingered in many communities. But she was optimistic. She believed that with kindness, understanding, and a willingness to connect, she could bridge any divide. She had a warm heart and an open mind, and she was ready to share them with her new neighbors. She envisioned block parties, friendly chats over the fence, and a strong sense of community. This was her dream, and she was determined to make it a reality. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and organizing. Tony focused on making her house a home, carefully arranging her furniture and hanging her favorite artwork. She made an effort to smile and wave at the neighbors as they passed by, eager to establish friendly connections. However, she soon noticed a subtle undercurrent of unease. There were the stairs, lingering just a beat too long, filled with a mixture of curiosity and something she couldn't quite decipher. One woman, watering her petunias, stopped and watched Tony unload boxes from her car, her expression unreadable. When Tony offered a friendly, "Good morning," the woman simply nodded curtly and turned away. Then there were the comments, seemingly innocent on the surface, but laced with a subtle sting. At the local grocery store, the cashier asked, "Are you new to the area? You don't see many newcomers around here." The emphasis on newcomers, and the implication that she didn't quite belong, hung in the air. Another neighbor, while admiring Tony's flower pots, remarked, "Those are certainly colorful. It's nice to see someone adding a little flair to the neighborhood." The way she said colorful and flair made Tony feel like she was being subtly criticized for not conforming to the neighborhood's established aesthetic. These small instances, seemingly insignificant on their own, began to accumulate, creating a sense of discomfort. Tony tried to brush them off, reminding herself that it was probably just a matter of getting used to a new environment. But a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that she was being judged and scrutinized, not for who she was, but for what she represented. The initial excitement began to wane, replaced by a growing apprehension. Was this the fresh start she had hoped for, or was she simply trading one set of challenges for another? Among the neighbors, one stood out for his particularly cold demeanor, Bob. He lived 2 houses down, an older white man with a stern face and a perpetually grumpy expression. He seemed to avoid eye contact with everyone, but Tony noticed he often watched her from his porch, his gaze unreadable and intense. He was always meticulously tending to his lawn, mowing it with precise, unwavering strokes. His house was perfectly maintained, every window gleaming, every shingle in place. It was as if he was trying to create an impenetrable barrier between himself and the outside world. Tony had tried to offer a friendly wave a few times, but Bob had either ignored her completely or offered a curt nod that barely registered as acknowledgement. His body language screamed, "Stay away." She noticed other neighbors seemed to give him a wide berth, too, as if they were afraid of disturbing him. One afternoon, while Tony was struggling to assemble a new garden bench, Bob walked past, pushing his lawnmower. Tony, hoping to break the ice, called out, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind holding this piece for just a second?" It's being a little tricky. Bob stopped, his expression hardening. He looked at the bench, then at Tony, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. Without a word, he reluctantly took the piece of wood from her, holding it stiffly as Tony fumbled with the screws. "Thank you," Tony said, offering a genuine smile. Bob grunted in response and handed the wood back as soon as she was finished. He turned and walked away without another word, his back rigid and uninviting. Tony sighed. It was clear that Bob was not going to be an easy neighbor to befriend. He seemed determined to remain isolated and unfriendly, a stark contrast to the welcoming community she had envisioned. The tension between Tony and Bob reached a boiling point one Saturday morning. Tony was hanging an American flag on her porch, a symbol of her patriotism and a way to show her pride in her country. She'd always flown a flag, no matter where she lived. Bob was across the street, watering his lawn. He stopped, his eyes narrowed, and stared at Tony. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke, his voice laced with a harshness Tony hadn't heard before. "You people," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, "you people don't serve this country." Tony froze, her hands still clutching the flag. Her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. The words hung in the air, heavy with prejudice and ignorance. It was one thing to experience subtle microaggressions, but this was a direct, blatant attack. "Excuse me?" Tony asked, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to maintain her composure, but the anger was rising within her. Bob didn't back down. "You heard me," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "You people are always complaining, always demanding things. You don't appreciate what this country has given you. You don't serve." Tony's anger flared. "How dare you?" she retorted, her voice rising. "How dare you make such a sweeping generalization about me and my people? You don't know anything about me. You don't know anything about what I've done for this country." She wanted to tell him about her grandfather, a decorated World War II veteran. She wanted to tell him about her cousin, who is currently serving in the Air Force. She wanted to tell him about her own volunteer work in the community. But the words caught in her throat, choked by a mixture of rage and disbelief. Bob's words had cut deep, striking at the core of her identity and her sense of belonging. Despite the shock and hurt that washed over her, Tony refused to let Bob's words define her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. She knew that getting into a shouting match would only validate his prejudices. Instead, she decided to stand her ground, to challenge his assumption with a quiet but firm resolve. "Bob," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "you don't know me. You don't know my family. You have no right to make such a statement." She lowered the flag, carefully folding it in her arms. "My grandfather fought in World War II," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "He risked his life for this country. My cousin is serving in the Air Force right now, protecting our freedom, and I volunteer at the local homeless shelter, helping people in need. How can you say that I don't serve this country?" Tony looked directly into Bob's eyes, her gaze unwavering. "Serving this country isn't just about wearing a uniform," she said. "It's about contributing to our community, about making a difference in people's lives. It's about being a good citizen, about upholding the values that this country stands for." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. "You may not see it, Bob," she continued, "but people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, serve this country in countless ways. Your statement is not only hurtful, but it's also completely ignorant." She wanted him to understand the depth of his error, the harm caused by his narrow-minded view. She held his gaze, silently pleading with him to reconsider his beliefs. Bob stood there for a moment, his face flushed, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for an escape. He seemed caught off guard by Tony's calm and reasoned response. Perhaps he had expected her to erupt in anger, confirming his preconceived notions. But her composure had disarmed him, forcing him to confront the possibility that he might be wrong. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge her words. He simply stared at her, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion. Tony could see the internal struggle raging within him. He was a man trapped by his own prejudices, unable to break free from the chains of his own beliefs. Suddenly, he seemed to reach a breaking point. Without a word, he turned abruptly and stomped towards his house. His movements were jerky and agitated, his shoulders hunched. He fumbled with the doorknob, his hands shaking slightly. Then, with a loud crash, he slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The force of the slam reverberated through Tony's body, a physical manifestation of the anger and resentment that had been simmering beneath the surface. Tony stood there, stunned, the folded flag still clutched in her arms. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the chirping of birds in the trees. She watched Bob's house, her heart heavy with disappointment. She had hoped, against all odds, that she could reach him, that she could break through his wall of prejudice. But it was clear that he wasn't ready to listen. He had retreated into his fortress of anger and ignorance, slamming the door on any possibility of understanding or connection. The encounter left Tony feeling deflated and discouraged, questioning whether she could ever truly find a place in this neighborhood. Inside her house, Tony sank onto the couch, the folded flag still resting in her lap. The anger was slowly giving way to a deep sense of humiliation and disappointment. Bob's words replayed in her mind, each repetition a fresh wound. "You people don't serve this country." The prejudice in his voice was like a physical blow. She felt exposed, vulnerable. The haven she had hoped to create had been shattered by a single, hateful statement. The dream of a welcoming community seemed further away than ever. She felt foolish for believing that she could simply move into this neighborhood and be accepted. Tears welled up in her eyes. She had worked so hard to build a good life for herself, to overcome the obstacles that had been placed in her path. And now, here she was, feeling like an outsider, unwelcome and unwanted. The thought of moving out crossed her mind. Was it worth staying in a place where she was clearly not valued? Was it worth enduring the constant microaggressions and the blatant prejudice? Maybe it would be easier to just cut her losses and find a place where she could truly feel a home. She picked up her phone and started searching for apartments in other neighborhoods. The familiar listings scrolled across the screen, each one a potential escape from this uncomfortable reality. But as she looked at the pictures of sterile apartments and crowded city streets, a different feeling began to emerge. Giving up felt like letting Bob win. It felt like admitting defeat. And Tony was not a quitter. She had faced challenges before, and she had always found a way to overcome them. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make this work. But the road ahead seemed long and daunting, filled with uncertainty and pain. The anger, humiliation, and a nagging doubt of whether she belonged clouded her thoughts. A few days passed, filled with an uneasy silence. Tony avoided Bob's house, and he, in turn, seemed to disappear altogether. She focused on unpacking the remaining boxes, trying to create a sense of normalcy in her new home. She planted flowers, cleaned the windows, and rearranged the furniture, desperate to reclaim the joy she had felt before the confrontation. Then, one afternoon, as Tony was watering her newly planted roses, she saw him. Bob was walking towards her, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He looked different somehow, smaller and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He wasn't mowing his lawn or meticulously tending to his house. He just walked, slowly and deliberately, towards her. As he got closer, Tony noticed something glinting in his hand. It was a small, purple heart-shaped medal attached to a ribbon. She recognized it instantly. A Purple Heart, awarded to soldiers wounded or killed in action. He stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't speak for a moment, as if struggling to find the right words. Tony waited, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to expect. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a deep sense of shame and regret. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He held out the Purple Heart towards her. I said some terrible things, and I was wrong. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Tony was completely taken aback. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any kind of apology, let alone one accompanied by such a powerful symbol of sacrifice and service. Tony looked at the Purple Heart, then back at Bob, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure what to say. The medal was a powerful symbol, but it didn't excuse his words. It didn't erase the pain he had inflicted. I don't understand, she said, her voice still hesitant. Why are you showing me this? Bob took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he held the medal. I'm a Vietnam War veteran, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I served my country. I was wounded in combat. That's why I have this. He paused, his eyes clouding over with painful memories. But the war, it changed me, he continued. It filled me with anger and bitterness. I saw things, terrible things, things that I can never forget. He looked at Tony, his eyes pleading for understanding. I came back a different person, he said. I was angry at the world. I was angry at everyone. And I let that anger fester inside me for years. He explained that his experiences in the war had led him to develop deep-seated prejudices. He had seen so much death and destruction that he had started to distrust anyone who was different from him. He admitted that his views were wrong, but he struggled to let go of the anger and resentment that had consumed him for so long. I know it's no excuse, he said, but I wanted you to understand where I was coming from. The war, it warped my mind. He wanted her to know that the man who had spoken those hateful words was not the man he truly wanted to be. The war had broken him. The air hung heavy with unspoken words. Tony studied Bob's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was genuine remorse. The anger that had been simmering within her began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. I was wrong, Tony, Bob said, his voice barely audible. I was wrong to judge you. I was wrong to say those things. You didn't deserve that. He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. I let my anger get the best of me, he continued. I saw your flag, and I just reacted. I made assumptions about you based on nothing but the color of your skin. And that was wrong. So wrong. He paused, taking a shaky breath. I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused you, he said. I know my words can't be taken back, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. He wanted her to understand that his apology was sincere, that he truly regretted his actions. He offered the Purple Heart again, his hand outstretched. This medal, it doesn't make me a better person, he said. It just reminds me of his sacrifices that so many people have made for this country. And it reminds me of the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. Tony hesitated for a moment, then gently reached out and took the medal. It felt heavy in her hand, a tangible symbol of Bob's past and a testament to his willingness to change. She knew that forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but Bob's apology had opened a door to the possibility of healing and understanding. It was the start of a new chapter. Tony was genuinely surprised by Bob's vulnerability. She had expected him to be stubborn and unyielding, a man entrenched in his prejudices. But here he was, standing before her, his defenses down, his heart exposed. She looked at the Purple Heart in her hand, its smooth surface cool against her skin. It was a symbol of his sacrifice, of the trauma he had endured. And it was also a symbol of his willingness to change, to confront his own demons. Thank you, Bob, she said, her voice soft. Thank you for apologizing. It means a lot to me. She invited him to sit with her on the porch, and he gratefully accepted. He began to tell her more about his experiences in Vietnam, about the horrors he had witnessed, about the friends he had lost. He spoke of the guilt he carried, the nightmares that still haunted him, the anger that had consumed him for so long. Tony listened with empathy, her heart aching for the pain he had endured. She knew that war could leave deep scars, both visible and invisible. She couldn't fully understand what he had gone through, but she could appreciate the burden he carried. As he spoke, she began to see him in a new light. He wasn't just a grumpy, prejudiced old man. He was a wounded veteran, a man struggling to cope with the trauma of his past. He was a human being, flawed and imperfect, but capable of growth and change. She recognized that the road to recovery was long, and he needed someone who could listen to him. The apology began a bridge between them. After Bob finished sharing his story, Tony felt it was her turn to speak. She knew that understanding was a two-way street. She gently placed the Purple Heart on the porch swing beside them. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Bob," she said. "I can't imagine what you went through, but I also know what it's like to be judged and discriminated against." She began to share her own experiences with prejudice, from the subtle microaggressions she had encountered in her new neighborhood to the more overt acts of discrimination she had faced throughout her life. She told them about the time she had been followed in stores, the time she had been passed over for promotions, the time she had been made to feel like she didn't belong. She described the pain of being stereotyped, the frustration of having her identity reduced to the color of her skin. She explained how Bob's words, though perhaps fueled by his own pain, had reinforced those stereotypes and added to the burden she already carried. "When you said, 'You people don't serve this country,' it felt like you were erasing my entire existence," she said. "It felt like you were denying my humanity, my contributions, my very right to be here." She wanted him to understand the impact of his words, to see how they had cut through her like a knife. She hoped that by sharing her own experiences, she could help him to see the world from her perspective, to understand the pain and frustration that came with being Black in America. She wanted to build empathy. She needed him to know how much his words had hurt. As Tony and Bob continued to talk, an unlikely connection began to form between them. Despite their differences in age, race, and background, they discovered a shared understanding of pain and loss. Bob had lost friends in the war and carried the burden of those memories with him every day. Tony had lost opportunities and faced constant challenges because of the color of her skin. They both knew what it felt like to be judged, to be misunderstood, to be treated unfairly. They both knew what it felt like to carry a weight on their shoulders, a weight that no one else could see. Bob began to see Tony not just as a Black woman, but as a fellow human being who had experienced her own share of suffering. Tony began to see Bob not just as a prejudiced old man, but as a wounded veteran who was struggling to heal. They found common ground in their shared humanity, in their shared vulnerability. They realized that they were both broken in different ways, but that they could help each other to mend. They talked about their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They shared stories about their families, their friends, their lives. They laughed together, and they cried together. Slowly but surely, the wall that had separated them began to crumble. The prejudice that had clouded Bob's judgment began to dissipate. The anger and resentment that had consumed Tony began to fade. They discovered that beneath the surface of their differences, they were both just people, longing for connection and understanding. They began a new chapter, a chapter of healing. The porch became their sanctuary, a place where they could share their stories and connect on a deeper level. What had started as a tense confrontation had transformed into an unlikely friendship. They began to have regular conversations, meeting on the porch almost every afternoon. They talked about everything and nothing, from the weather to their favorite books to their political views. They didn't always agree, but they always listened to each other with respect and an open mind. Tony learned about Bob's life before the war, about his childhood growing up on a farm, about his dreams of becoming a teacher. She learned about his love for classic literature and his passion for gardening. Bob learned about Tony's career as a social worker, about her dedication to helping others, about her love for music and her talent for cooking. He learned about the challenges she had faced as a Black woman in America and the strength and resilience she had shown in overcoming them. Through these conversations, they began to understand each other's perspectives and to appreciate each other's experiences. They realized that their differences were not barriers, but rather opportunities to learn and grow. They challenged each other's assumptions, they broadened each other's horizons, and they helped each other to heal. Their friendship became a testament to the power of connection, a reminder that even the most unlikely of people can find common ground and build bridges of understanding. The more they talked, the closer they became. The more Bob learned about Tony's life and the experiences of other people of color, the more he began to question his own prejudices. He started to recognize the subtle ways in which racism and discrimination manifested in everyday life. He began to see the world through a different lens. He started challenging his own ingrained beliefs, questioning the assumptions he had made for so long. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes, he would catch himself thinking or saying something that was insensitive or offensive. But instead of dismissing it, he would stop and reflect on what he had said and why it was wrong. He also began to speak out against prejudice and discrimination whenever he encountered it. He challenged his friends and neighbors when they made insensitive comments. He wrote letters to the editor of the local newspaper, advocating for diversity and inclusion. Bob became an advocate for change in the neighborhood. He started attending community meetings and speaking out in favor of policies that would promote equality and opportunity. He even organized a neighborhood block party to celebrate diversity and to bring people from different backgrounds together. He encouraged other neighbors to get to know Toni and to learn about her experiences. He wanted them to see her not as an outsider, but as a valuable member of the community. Bob was changing, and he wanted to help others change too. His transformation was inspiring. As Bob became more outspoken about his newfound beliefs, Toni and Bob's friendship deepened. They were no longer just neighbors who tolerated each other. They were true friends who supported and encouraged each other. They started spending more time together, not just on the porch, but also exploring the community. They went to concerts, visited museums, and volunteered at the local soup kitchen. They shared meals, celebrated holidays, and supported each other through difficult times. Their friendship became a symbol of hope and understanding in the community. People started to notice the change in Bob, the transformation from a grumpy, isolated old man to an engaged and compassionate neighbor. They saw the genuine affection between Toni and Bob, the respect and admiration they had for each other. Their unlikely friendship challenged people's assumptions and inspired them to rethink their own prejudices. Other neighbors started to reach out to Toni, to get to know her, to learn from her experiences. The subtle microaggressions began to fade away, replaced by genuine acts of kindness and acceptance. Toni and Bob's friendship showed the community that it was possible to overcome differences, to bridge divides, and to build a more inclusive and welcoming neighborhood. They were a reminder that even the most deeply ingrained prejudices could be challenged and overcome with empathy, understanding, and a willingness to change. Their bond brought hope. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to change. People started to embrace diversity and to work together to create a more inclusive environment. More families from different backgrounds moved into the neighborhood, bringing with them new perspectives and experiences. The local school started offering multicultural programs to educate children about different cultures and traditions. The community center organized events to celebrate diversity, such as potlucks, where people could share their favorite dishes from around the world, and festivals where they could showcase their cultural heritage. Neighbors started to reach out to each other, to learn about each other's lives, and to build relationships based on respect and understanding. They formed book clubs to discuss books by authors from diverse backgrounds, and they organized volunteer projects to help people in need. The neighborhood became a more vibrant and welcoming place, a place where everyone felt like they belonged. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were still challenges to overcome, and there were still people who clung to their prejudices. But the overall atmosphere had changed, and there was a sense of hope and optimism that had not been there before. Toni and Bob's friendship became the spark that ignited a positive transformation in their community. The neighborhood was becoming a true community. Years later, Toni sat on her porch, watching the children play in the street. The neighborhood was a vibrant tapestry of colors and cultures, a testament to the power of change. She smiled, remembering her initial doubts, her fear that she would never truly belong. She thought about Bob, who had passed away a few years earlier. His absence was still felt deeply in the community, but his legacy lived on. He had taught them the importance of empathy, the power of forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Toni reflected on her journey, from the initial excitement of moving into her new home to the painful confrontation with Bob to the unlikely friendship that had blossomed between them. She realized that even in the face of prejudice and hate, understanding and connection were always possible. She had learned that people were capable of change, that even the most deeply ingrained prejudices could be overcome with empathy, compassion, and a willingness to listen. She also learned the importance of standing up for what you believe in, of challenging injustice, and of speaking out against hate. Her journey had been difficult, but it had also been incredibly rewarding. She had found a home in a place where she had once felt like an outsider. She had built a community based on respect, understanding, and love. As she watched the children play, she felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over her. She knew that there would always be challenges to face, but she also knew that she was not alone. She had a community of friends and neighbors who supported her, who loved her, and who believed in her. And that was all that mattered. Her dream of a welcoming community had come true.